Next chapter, A Minute in the Morning. I hated sleeping upstairs in that big square room at Grandma's. Joy wasn't across the hall like the summers when we were kids. The mattress on the big brass bed had more craters than the moon, and you could barely see your hand in front of your face. In Chicago, it never really got dark, not like this. And the house was too quiet, though things scuttled in the walls. Once in a while, a thumping sound came from across overhead in the attic. I didn't think Grandma's house was haunted. What ghost would dare? But she slept downstairs to spare herself the climb, so I was miles from anybody. What I'd have done without my radio, I don't know. Grandma, who could hear all over the house, didn't like extra noise, so I played the Philco at night in bed, muffled in the covers. With radio, you never knew. I could only pick up the Chicago stations if there wasn't a cloud in the sky, and it took a crisp, clear night to bring in KMOX from St. Louis. I didn't listen to much news. Most of it was bad. They still couldn't find Amelia Earhart, and 10 million men were out of work. I knew my dad was one of them. But I figured everything else on the radio, and I loved everything else on the radio. Baby Snooks, Fibber McGee and Molly, the A&P Gypsies, Edgar Bergen and Charlie McCarthy, Whisperin' Jack Smith. The best thing about radio was that you couldn't see anything, so you pictured it in your mind. All the men were just as handsome as movie stars, as Tyrone Power, and all the women were as beautiful as you hoped you'd be. Their voices were who they were, and the biggest voice belonged to Kate Smith, the songbird of the South. That fall, the whole country was singing her "When the Moon Comes Over the Mountain, Every Beam Brings a Dream, Dear, of You." I'd lie there in the orange glow of the Philco dial, listening to the world. Then I'd see how fast I could fall asleep after I shut it off. By November, I was cold. Wind howled in the eaves and found every chink in the house. With the window jammed shut, there was still a stiff breeze in the room, and I could see my breath. I took to wearing old chenille bathrobe to bed over my pajamas. I considered wearing my plaid coat too, but thought I better save something back for winter. Finally, I made the mistake of complaining to Grandma. "You never saw a more surprised woman in your life." "Cold?" she said. "It doesn't get cold anymore. The climate's changed. When I was a girl, we had to walk in our sleep to keep from freezing to death." One morning after a hard frost, Grandma stood at the foot of the stairs, banging a spoon against a pan, her wake-up call. When I came into the kitchen, dressed in 3 layers, she was pouring batter on a waffle iron, and coffee perked. She let me drink coffee. The scent of her cooking breakfast was to follow me through life. But I was sulky that morning. "Grandma, what am I doing up at the crack of dawn? There's no school today." She turned to give me one of her repertoire of surprised looks. It was daylight, and that was like noon to her. "Well, of course there's no school. It's Armistice Day." People took Armistice Day seriously back then, 19 years after the end of the Great War. And as I said before, the Great War was World War I, as it became later known. In Chicago, everything stopped at 11 o'clock, even the streetcars. People stood for a minute of silence, remembering. "And the turkey shoot," Grandma said. I knew they had a turkey shoot on Armistice Day down here. Posters were up in Moore's store and Wiedenbach's bank. An awful thought struck me. A turkey shoot. What if Grandma took part? I remembered Grandpa Dowdle's old 12-gauge double-barreled Winchester behind the wood box. Grandma read my mind. She was turning bacon and waved me away with a fork. "If I took out after an old turkey with that 12-gauge, I'd blow 'em apart. There'd be nothing left but wattle and shot." The terrible picture of an exploding turkey raining feathers hung in my mind. But Grandma said, "It's not like that. They use air rifles and buy chances to shoot at paper cutouts. They don't shoot real turkeys. What would you do with a plugged turkey this far ahead of Thanksgiving?" "You could keep it upstairs in my bedroom where it would stay frozen, but I didn't say so. Besides, I don't compete, Grandma pursed her lips, ladylike except for the toothpick. It's the men and the boys. You know how they love an excuse to make a clatter and show off. A turkey shoot was bound to be outdoors, and my nose was just now thawing. That's why we are going? I asked, hopeless. For the burgoo, Grandma explained. And I didn't even ask. Now, a side note here, they do still have a burgoo festival up near Starved Rock State Park in Utica. Every year they have a burgoo festival, so listen carefully. The Armistice Day turkey shoot was held on the Abernathy farm. Grandma and I went out there on Shank's ponies, meaning we walked. They planted next year's wheat and autumn colors had faded. It was getting into the gray time of year. We tramped the road south into the wind until we saw horses tied to the fence posts and cars pulled off on the shoulder. Grandma wore Grandpa Dowdle's old coat, and I wore his hunting jacket, and dungarees under a skirt. The longer I lived down here, the more I was starting to look like Mildred Burdick. A wool cap pulled down to my eyebrows didn't help. The Abernathy farm looked long abandoned, though people milled around it. Out in a field, they'd set up frames with orange paper targets, more or less shaped like turkeys. And there was a gun rack. Since the turkey shoot was for charity, men in little caps were selling chances. They were the American Legion, veterans of the Great War. The barn was in bad shape, and the house hadn't seen a lick of paint this century. All the ladies were clustered on the back porch. Does anybody live here? I asked Grandma. The Abernathys, she said, swinging wide the gate and marching up the walk. That's Mrs. Abernathy in the door. The other ladies clustered around a table on the porch beside a rusting cream separator. Mrs. Abernathy stood by, holding her elbows and looking down. She was a forlorn lady with a sweater pulled over her apron. In the yard, a big pot hung from a tripod over a crackling fire. It was the burgoo, a stew made with whatever you had on hand. White meat and red meat, and maybe squirrel. Any old vegetable, heavy on the turnips, potato wedges for body, stewed tomatoes for color, onions to taste. It was served at every outdoor event, from an auction to a hanging, as Grandma would say. A small lady in a headscarf under an army cap stirred the burgoo with a wooden paddle. Grandma veered off the walk and took the paddle out of her hand. I'll spell you, Wilma. Go for more kindling, she said, and the small lady fell back. The whole porch was watching. I wanted to put some distance between me and Grandma, so I drifted out of the yard and down to the barn lot, where the crack and pop of air rifles rent the air. Men and boys were ranked along the firing line before each distant turkey target. I didn't recognize any of them, but then they were all in caps with ear flaps. They took their shooting seriously, but man and boy, they either weren't crack-shocked or those paper turkeys were harder to hit than they looked. Both the barn and the shed were taking a pelting. The American Legionnaires were handing over the rifles and reloading, and I must have been standing too close. A Legionnaire handed me a rifle, and I took it. At the touch of cold steel, I froze. From the way I was dressed, did they think I was a boy? Had he missed the skirt over my dungarees? This might have given Annie Oakley her big chance, but I was embarrassed to death. I couldn't wait to get rid of that rifle. I handed it off to the shooter next to me. It was Augie Fluke, with his flaps down. Ever since Grandma had glued his head, Augie had never looked me in the eye. He was a skulker by nature anyway. Now he blinded at the sight of me, but his eyes narrowed and I read his mind. He was going to show me a thing or two about marksmanship. He knew my Grandma was a dead shot, but she was a mere woman. Did I read all this in Augie's squint? If you're going to read minds, start with a simple one. He jammed the butt of the rifle into one of his sloping shoulders. His tongue lolled out as he sighted down the barrel and took considered aim. Then, as bad luck would have it, a scared rabbit, a big cottontail, darted from under the barn and across the front of the targets. Seeing the live prey blurred Augie's judgment. Forgetting the paper target, he swung his rifle around to follow the rabbit. He swung too far. A big black car, a Buick, I think, was parked on the sideline, and just as the rabbit disappeared under it, Augie fired. The crowd looked at the car. In the silence you could hear a hiss as the back tire, a white sidewall, began to go flat. A legionnaire howled and threw his cap on the ground. He must have been the head legionnaire because the cap had medals pinned to it. "Dag nabbit, that was a new tire. Now who done that?" Augie went rigid and thought about thrusting the rifle back into my hands. Then he flung it down and plunged headlong into the crowd. They made way for him, whooping and clapping and pretending to duck. He vaulted a fence and hit the road running, back to town. So a turkey shoot wasn't as boring as I expected. But I went on watching from up on the yard. They shot some more. Then the head legionnaire threw up his arm. "Troopers, hold your fire. It's pretty near 11 o'clock. Silence fell. Some in the crowd took out their watches to make sure. It was the 11th hour of the 11th day of the 11th month, the moment when the Armistice of the Great War had been signed in 1918. We all turned to face east, as people did, toward France. I turned to see a back view of Grandma. Her left hand was outstretched, holding the paddle upright in the burgoo. Her right hand must have been over her heart. Her old hat was pulled low and pinned tight, and her hair was escaping. I never saw her shoulders straighter. The ladies on the porch stood facing a blank wall because it was east. Mrs. Abernathy had turned in the door. An utter stillness measured a minute, with only the crying wind and the rattle of a dry creeper growing up the side of the Abernathy's house. Just then, did I see a face in a dormer window upstairs? I might have. I wasn't sure.